So the shorthand for melatonin that you read all the time is that it's a sleep hormone, and it most emphatically is not. But what does caffeine do? Well, it blocks adenosine receptors within the brain, so it masks the fact of how tired you are. The World Health Organization has classified night shift work as a probable carcinogen.
Russell, I want to start off talking about the quote-unquote sleep hormone melatonin. People these days want to make sure they're protecting it by blocking blue light. A lot of people are supplementing with it. But when it comes to sleep, it's not everything that it's cracked up to be. So I'll have you talk about that to kick off.
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting issues there, both melatonin and blue light. So the shorthand for melatonin that you read all the time is that it's a sleep hormone, and it most emphatically is not. It's a mild modulator of sleep at best, and not in everybody, about 70% of people. So what we know about melatonin is that the circadian clock drives up, it anticipates darkness, so melatonin rises, it peaks at around about 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, depends on who you are, and then anticipating dawn, it then goes back down again. So if you don't produce melatonin, and many people on beta blockers will only produce, very low levels of melatonin, and if you're a quadriplegic, then you don't produce any melatonin at all. And in studies, so the quadriplegic study is very interesting because they were reported to have terrible sleep. And it was thought, okay, well, they're not producing pineal melatonin, therefore it's the sleep hormone. Well, actually, quadriplegic sleep is no worse than paraplegic sleep, and they produce normal levels of melatonin. People on beta blockers have mild changes in their sleep, but really it's not very marked. So when you take melatonin half an hour or so before bedtime, and around about, let's say, 5 milligrams, the best study ever published showed that it will reduce the time it takes to get to sleep by about 20 to 30 minutes. And that's it. It can also probably enhance your ability to adapt to a new time zone and be a mild modulator of jet lag, but it is not a sleep hormone. So yeah, there's a lot of nonsense talked about it out there. I mean, a few years ago, there was a whole business about melatonin being an antioxidant, an anti-cancer drug, and people were going around saying, well, the doubling in childhood leukemias since the 1950s is because children are using night lights, which suppress melatonin, and therefore taking away this cancer anti-cancer agent. It's just nonsense. The amount of light you get from a night light is never going to suppress melatonin, and in fact, you need quite a bit of light to suppress melatonin. So yeah,
I want to get into the light piece, but to highlight what you just said there. When melatonin could be useful as a supplement would be if somebody is traveling and they're going into a new time zone, it could help with that adjustment. Or there was the one study where it could help somebody fall asleep a bit quicker.
Yeah,
but in general, melatonin is overhyped when it comes to sleep.
Absolutely, yes. There's probably a placebo effect. A lot of individuals with children with neurodevelopmental disorders, the parents often try and help their children sleep with melatonin, and the results are very mixed. There's nothing else really out there. We can talk about new drug development later on. And I think that's why people have become obsessed by melatonin and, in fact, tried to use new compounds synthesized that will mimic the effects of melatonin on melatonin receptors. So there are other drugs out there which you can patent and then sell for quite a lot of money.
Let's get into the light piece and tie it into melatonin. You mentioned the night light and how it takes a lot of light to impact our melatonin production. Now the grounds are getting shaky whether that really even matters or not. But let's talk about how light fits in. And then let's talk about our endogenous melatonin production. And we've been kind of focusing on the supplemental. And let's talk about the melatonin we make and whether that's important or not.
So light is critically important for setting our internal biological clock, our circadian rhythms, to the external world. And so the light-dark cycle sets the master clock within the brain in a paired structure called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, and via a multisynaptic projection via the sympathetic nervous system, it innervates the pineal, and then it regulates its output. And what's fascinating is that the duration of melatonin release expands and contracts throughout the seasons. It's a nice measure of dark length. Now, in humans, we don't know if that expanding and contracting melatonin profile is doing anything. However, in seasonally breeding mammals, so deer, sheep, in the autumn, the expanded night length encodes the fact that it's autumn, and that will trigger reproduction. So these large mammals will breed. The young will be gestating over the winter months to be born in the spring, when there's lots of new grass to generate milk production in the mum, and lots of food for weaning. And there, melatonin has an absolutely critical role. So for seasonal biology. There's no clear evidence that it's having a big effect upon our seasonal biology. We do show seasonal rhythms, interestingly enough. And in the pre-industrial era, there were sort of times of the year where there were more children produced than other times of the year. But again, whether it was social factors or whether it was driven by, like in sheep, a melatonin profile, we don't know.
Is there any value in melatonin in humans then? We're debunking a lot of stuff here, and you talked about in animals how there can be value with reproduction. But have we figured out any benefits of melatonin in the human body?
Well, I tend to think of melatonin as a bit like a reinforcing agent. So light comes in, hits the molecular clock, and aligns it to the external world. And then via this loop and the pineal, melatonin is produced, and we know that there are melatonin receptors in the master clock. And so it's probably acting to reinforce the direct light input from the eye to the master clock. So it's sort of, I suppose, a bit of a stabilizer. That's how I would think of melatonin.
Well, let's get into the nightlight, come back to that piece again, because there is so much talk in the health and wellness space these days of blocking the blue light at night and preserving our melatonin production, as I talked about earlier. You alluded to the fact that a nightlight isn't going to really do much when it comes to melatonin production. But let's get into light and blue light blocking glasses and people dimming the lights at night. I want to know, is there any value in any of this?
It's complex. So we discovered that there's a third photoreceptor system, light-sensitive system within the eye. There's the visual cells, the rods and the cones, and then there are these photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So the retina, there's a layer of cells called the ganglion cells. Their axons form the optic nerve, and they send light-dark information into the brain. And of course, primarily, most of that is vision. But 1 out of every 100 of those ganglion cells is directly sensitive to light using a photopigment called melanopsin, or OPN4, and that pigment is maximally sensitive to blue light. So that's where the whole blue light story has come from. However, it's again not straightforward. First of all, although the peak of sensitivity is in the blue at 480 nanometers, it's a bell-shaped curve. And so it's not just sensitive to blue light, it's sensitive to a broad a range of light. And if the light is bright enough, it doesn't matter much what the color or the wavelength is. Furthermore, we thought originally that the rods and cones had no role in the regulation of the clock, but now we know that they can modify the activity of those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So the spectral or color input into the circadian system is potentially very broad. We're trying to work out exactly how the rods and cones are interacting with those photosensitive ganglion cells. But the bottom line is, yes, they're maximally sensitive to light. But if the light is bright enough, it really doesn't matter what the color is. And so that's another kind of a bit of a myth debunked. So why is light important? And why are blue blocking glasses important? Well, they've been used in ophthalmology. And the argument there is blue light can increase age-related macular degeneration, one of these diseases of the eye. There's actually no good evidence that they have any effect on the rate of age-related macular degeneration. There was a study out of New Zealand and Australia recently suggesting that there was no really solid data. Blue blocking light, if it's low, will reduce the effects of light on our alerting systems. So those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are not just circadian photoreceptors. They do a bunch of other stuff as well. They actually contribute to our ability to constrict our pupils. But they importantly also increase our levels of alertness. And our levels of alertness, the light to increase alertness is probably we need less light to increase alertness. Our alertness is more sensitive to light than the clock. The biological clock needs masses of light to shift it. And so there's all this worry about using blue emitting light devices before you go to bed. There was a big study published a few years ago now looking at ebooks, something like a Kindle, on its maximum intensity. And it was shown that 4 hours of Kindle use immediately before bedtime on 5 consecutive nights delayed sleep onset, and it was just statistically significant by 10 minutes. So, those sorts of device levels of levels of light are probably not that important, but they might increase alertness. And the problem with devices, of course, is that they will have a slight alerting effect on the brain, but what they will do independently of light is alert the brain because, of course, of the content. If you're using social media, if you're switching between news, your emails, and a whole bunch of other stuff, that's going to alert the brain, and that will delay sleep onset. So, bottom line, for most devices, they're probably not having much of an effect upon the clock. The amount of light might increase levels of alertness a bit. But what they will do, and where the data are the strongest, is to increase the activities that we undertake will increase the alertness of the brain and therefore delay sleep onset. So we've got to disentangle alertness, shifting the clock, and also the alerting effect of those devices, just because you're playing with all of these different things going on at the same time.
Got ya. So when it comes to alertness, you touched on the fact that it impacts how we fall asleep or the length of time to fall asleep. But has there been any research on how that impacts sleep after we've fallen asleep?
There's some evidence that if the lights are left on, that can also change our quality of sleep. Those data are just emerging, in fact, quite interesting. So, if you fall asleep with the lights on, you're much more likely to wake up than if you fall asleep with the lights off. So lights are doing something whilst we're asleep. Yeah, for sure.
Well, let's talk about in your life then, because you are knee deep in the science and you know the ins and outs. I assume you're not somebody that's wearing blue light blocking glasses then, because you mentioned the little bit of difference it might make when it comes to blue light and our internal clock. But talk about what you do at night then. When it comes to light, what you're doing and why you're doing it.
So it does make sense. I mean, one of the ironies, of course, is what's the last thing that most of us do before we go to bed? We stand in the most brightly lit room in the house, in the bathroom. We look into an illuminated mirror while we clean our teeth. And I've often wondered that it would make sense to have a bathroom mirror where there's a night setting and a day setting. So nice, bright, alerting light first thing in the morning, and then turn it to the night setting where there'd be lower levels of light, less alerting, and therefore less likely to delay your sleep onset. So minimize bright light exposure about 30 minutes before you go to bed. I think that will be the rule of thumb. Now, what you do need, of course, as we said, is to set this clock to the external world. And morning light is critically important to that. So for most of us, the clock is a little bit longer than 24 hours, on average about 24 hours, 10 minutes. So if we went to a deep dark cave where there's no light-dark cycle, then we would get up on average about 10 to 15 minutes later and later and later and later each day with respect to the outside. So what we need naturally is exposure to light to set the clock. Now, light doesn't have the same effect at different times of the day. So morning light advances the clock, makes you get up earlier in the morning. Dusk light delays the clock, makes you get up later the next morning. And we did a study on university students around the world, actually. And we showed that the later the chronotype, the more owl-like these students were, is the less morning light they got, which would make them get up earlier. But they slept through the morning, but then they got early evening, late afternoon light, which delays the clock. So part of our morningness versus eveningness can be affected by when we see light. And so we've recommended, when we were all agricultural workers, we got symmetrical exposure to light. So we stayed more or less aligned. But for teenagers, for example, and university students, they can be shifted later. Not exclusively, but partly due to when they see light.
So the important bit here is the fact that the clock is beyond 24 hours, just slightly, and we need to get that bright morning light as soon as we can in the morning to bring that clock. Yes, advance it and bring it back each and every day, ideally. And that's going to keep us, keep our internal clock in sync with everything in life.
Exactly, yes. Because, if you think about our biology, what we need to do is deliver the right stuff at the right concentration to the right organs and tissues at the right time of day. And so this clock acts as this master temporal structure on all of our biology, allowing us to do everything at the right time and the right sequence. And of course, for that to work, we have to align the internal day to the external world. And that's why light exposure is so very important. In fact, if you don't have eyes, then you drift through time. And we're working actually on Blind Veterans in the UK, Blind Veterans UK, the charity, and there's also Blind Veterans USA. We're working with those individuals to see what we can do. And in fact, part of our use of our understanding of how light is interacting with the clock, we've now got some drugs that will mimic the effects of light on the clock. And in our mouse studies, at least, we know we can actually fool the clock that it's seen light. Give this drug on a daily basis and take a drifting clock and make it exactly 24 hours, which is so cool because these individuals have no vision. We can't do much about that tragically, but we can, I think, eventually give them back a sense of biological time. And it's really important. These are most people who are radically blind, or they've lost their eyes, want to have as normal life as possible. They're fiercely independent, and so they structure their day as much as possible. I was talking to one chap who said he knew on a Wednesday he cut the lawn. So, he worked out where the lawnmower was within the shed and how he could generate lines on his lawn. And he was doing this, and then his wife came down and said, it's 3 a.m. in the morning. Basically, and this is, and in fact, it's very distressing because fiercely independent, they want to be, get on with their lives, and yet they feel as though they're constantly being tricked by their body and fooled. And it's a real knock on one's confidence. And so, it's going to be really important to give back that sense of time.
And an interesting piece of this is that for somebody who is blind, in that case you just gave, that's somebody that's actually physically lost their eyes. Because if somebody is just blind for other reasons, the light, talk about this, what research is showing that they can still set the clock by getting light even though they're not seeing the light.
That's right. This is some studies we started with mice, but we've also worked in individuals who've got eye disease. So they've lost their visual cells, they've lost their rods and cones, but they've retained those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. And what's so extraordinary is that these individuals can regulate their clocks perfectly normally. In fact, they also show a pupil constriction because, as I said, those photosensitive ganglion cells actually do more than just regulate the clock. So, no, it's really cool. But it raises a very important point, is that many ophthalmologists still don't know about this third receptor within the eye. And there has been a tendency to say, okay, well, you're blind. Your eyes are no use to you. They're going to be a source of infection because you can't see to look after them. Why don't we just, for simplicity's sake, remove them, put in a prosthetic, and of course, that'll be so much easier for you. And of course, what that can do, and has been done, is to then plunge somebody into circadian blindness. They've already had visual blindness, and then unwittingly, the removal of those eyes will give them essentially unremitting jet lag for the rest of their lives. It's changing, but it's still being done, which is really frightening.
So from a general sense here, putting this all together, we want to be cognizant of light at night, about a half hour before bed, you said, and just making sure we're dimming the lights. And then the other practical piece is when we get up in the morning, we're getting that light. I want to get granular on that morning light piece.
Okay.
Because some people are waking up, it's still dark out. We're going to get into hopefully later shift workers where they're, waking up or working during the night. But let's talk dosage. So somebody's getting up and they're saying, Russell, I'm in for this. I need to start working with light better in my life and my health. And how much and when do they do it? Let's get into all the nuances of how that works in the morning.
This is really important. So the first point to make is that the circadian system needs a lot of light to set it to the external world. And so what orders are we talking about? Well, we know that around about 10,000 lux for 30 minutes in the morning is really powerful at setting the clock. Now, most of us will live in rooms illuminated by artificial light, and it'll be 200 lux, 300 lux, it might get up to 400 lux. So it's not a particularly strong signal to shift the clock. So ideally what you do in the morning is you go outside because you've got bright natural light. In the winter months, it's trickier. So what you might want to do is sit in front of a light box, which is producing in excess of 2000 lux. Some people, in the autumn will sit right by a window and you can measure, you can use it. Actually, one thing that's fun to do is get a cheap lux meter, from Radio Shack or something, and just measure the differences in your light levels. It's a great student project, actually. And you'll see 3,000 lux at the window, and then as you go into the middle of the room, it can drop to 100 lux. Outside, it'll be 10,000 lux. And even in England, you can get up to 100,000 lux on a bright, sunny day.
So let's pick this apart a little bit more and get into the nuances. So for somebody who is, say, it's winter, there's still some light outside, but they're having their morning coffee in a sunroom, they're getting their light through a window. Is there anything that window's blocking that is, where they're not getting all the benefit of being outside?
Yeah, so there could well be enough light to regulate the clock, and it might be enough for alertness if you're sitting, with lots of in a glass house of some sort, or an orangery or whatever. But of course, what most glass does is remove UVB light. And it's UVB light, when it hits the skin, enables us to synthesize vitamin D. And vitamin D is really important for our immune system, of course, for calcium metabolism and bone regulation, and it's doing a whole bunch of important stuff. So, winter months, it's suggested that most people take vitamin D supplement because they're not going to get out much. They're not going to get much natural light exposure. And in fact, it's argued that in the winter months, pregnant women really should be taking vitamin D supplements because they're probably not making enough under natural circumstances unless they're outside. Now, even outside in the winter, you're going to get quite a bit of light, but inside, you're simply going to block out that UVB. It's very interesting. This was discovered in zoos, and so they use light, and all these reptiles under this glass canopy started dying, and they realized that the glass that they had used wasn't transmitting UVB. And the reptiles, the lizards, couldn't synthesize vitamin D, and therefore an essential element was missing, and they died in droves. So they had to refit all of these glass canopies in these zoos and aquarium.
So behind glass, you're going to miss out on the vitamin D piece, but you're still going to get what you need to set the internal clock.
Yeah, it's. As I say, get a cheap lux meter, and then you can actually assess how much in your room you're actually getting. And I think, in glass-walled orangeries and conservatories, I suspect enough will get through, but it may not. It's worth measuring. And as I say, you've got to be in that 2 to 10,000 lux range, for a good 30 minutes or so to reliably set the clock. It's a big issue in nursing home environments, where the sleep-wake cycles can be very poor. These individuals don't get very much natural light. And a colleague of mine, Auslan Summeren, in the Netherlands, went in and put big light banks in the day areas and had darkness in the bedrooms, was able to stabilize the light-dark cycle in these individuals. That stabilized the sleep-wake cycle. It was a remarkable improvement, and those individuals showing an improved sleep-wake cycle actually increased their cognitive abilities by 10%. So it's a really nice illustration that you can improve both sleep, and therefore you won't need as many sedatives in the nursing home, and you can improve cognition just by changing the lighting conditions in the nursing home. Ideally, what you'd hope is that there would be a sunroom, and these individuals would spend the morning in the sunroom getting that light to set the clock. So, anecdotally, so many people after a talk have come up to me and said, we took our aged mother on holiday, and, she just sat outside the cottage, and reading, and she said she'd never had better sleep. And of course, it was the advantages of being exposed to a bright morning light.
Well, let's come back to the light box piece. For somebody that is in the middle of winter and they're in a northern climate and they can't get outside before work and get, enough light that way, how effective are these?
They can be extremely effective. And Scandinavians living in the Arctic Circle, for example, in Tromsø, are very dependent upon them. So many families will have a light room. And so the whole family, they wake up, they go into the light room for 30 minutes, they get their photon shower, which sets the clock. So natural light, of course, is brighter, usually, if it's there. But if it's not there, then a light box can work very effectively.
I think you mentioned when we were talking about the people in the old age home, when they got the proper light, their cognition improved.
Yeah.
For somebody that has been neglectful when it comes to light in the morning, and they're losing that, say, by about 15 minutes every day, their clock is moving off kilter, what are some of the things they're going to notice over time?
Well, I think it's a really important point, because sleep-wake disruption is so much more than feeling tired at an inappropriate time. So sleep-wake disruption, that many of us will experience, particularly in the winter months, can increase our fluctuations in mood. What's interesting is that we're not getting a good night of sleep, and that can be enormously variable depending upon the individual, is that the tired brain remembers negative experiences but forgets positive ones. So your whole worldview is based upon negative experiences, which is so important to appreciate. Increased irritability, anxiety, loss of empathy, and sort of frustration. So you fail to pick up the social signals of others. You engage less effectively, and you certainly don't have the same levels of empathy. You tend to do more risk-taking, and you're a bit more impulsive. So you're doing stupid and unreflective things. There's a decrease, as we touched on, in cognitive performance if the sleep-wake cycle is starting to drift. Poor memory consolidation. Impaired decision-making and creativity, poor communication skills. So many of the faculties that make us these wonderful human beings, even our sense of humor, can be affected by a failure to entrain, to regulate the internal day with the external world. I've likened it to a bit like an orchestra. You've got this master clock within the brain, producing a rhythmic signal. And under normal circumstances, all of the members of the orchestra are playing at the same time. And so you get this beautiful symphony. But the failure to align all of these systems as a result of failure to get a strong exposure to light means that everything starts to drift apart. And so instead of a sort of a symphony, so instead of a symphony, you have this breakdown and a cacophony of sound. And that's a bit like what's happening to the body. Internal desynchrony when you're not optimizing circadian performance by internally aligning the day with the outside world.
I want to make sure at this point in the conversation we decipher between, we've been talking about this internal clock and setting that using light. This ties into sleep, but they're slightly different.
Yeah.
So as we're talking about all these different complications that can occur, how much of that is due to our internal clock falling out of sync, affecting sleep, and then that being, say, primary, secondary, and then tertiary being all these negative effects you talked about, versus the internal clock being a separate domain in and of itself?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question, Jesse, because what we've coined the phrase SCARD, which means sleep and circadian rhythm disruption. SCARD, because it's very difficult to disentangle what's an inappropriately aligned clock versus sleep disruption and sleep loss. So these are intimately connected. Now, you're right. The clock isn't just driving sleep. Sleep is immensely complicated. It's this essentially flip-flop between consciousness and sleep, involving a massive realignment of every brain neurotransmitter and multiple bits within the brain. And that's timed by the clock. It timestamps and says, now is the appropriate time for consciousness, now is the appropriate time for sleep. But there's another factor, which is perhaps the most intuitive factor about sleep, which is independent of the clock to some extent, which is from the moment we wake in the morning, sleep pressure, the need to go to sleep, rises and rises and rises. And then once we're asleep, it dissipates. And so sleep pressure is very, very low in the morning. So what happens during the day, and this is really exciting, because as the sleep pressure builds, the circadian clock is saying, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake, stay awake. So late afternoon, early evening, ironically, just before we go to bed, the circadian drive for wakefulness is at its very highest, counteracting this sleep pressure that's been built up during the day. Then the clock says, okay, time for sleep. The sleep pressure kicks in and the clock will be saying, you should be asleep, you should be asleep. And then as you approach morning, the sleep pressure, of course, is declined. And then the clock is saying, yeah, you might want to start thinking about waking up. And so when the clock's wakefulness drive exceeds that low level of sleep pressure, that's when we wake up. So these two things must be aligned for good sleep regulation. And the problem is, of course, is night shift work. So the assumption has been by many employers is that the clock will adapt with the demands of working at night. And it doesn't. In fact, it doesn't adapt at all, or very little. What's happening, of course, is you're getting dim light in the workplace. Then on the drive home in the morning, you're getting bright natural light. The clock always defers to the brighter light signal as being daytime. So the clock of a night shift worker and a day shift worker are broadly the same. So what's happening is that during the night shift, the circadian system is saying, hang on, you should be asleep. So the wakefulness drive is really low. But you're having to, but you haven't slept. So the sleep pressure is huge, absolutely huge. So you finish the night shift, you go home, sleep pressure is high, so you fall asleep pretty quickly. But then, of course, the clock is saying, hang on, it's daytime. You should be awake. So many night shift workers get very short duration sleep during the day after the night shift. It can be as little as 5 hours. So, and that's a good example of a misalignment between the sleep need, the sleep pressure, and the biological clock.
So when it comes to night shift workers, you're talking about it there in a practical sense, how for most people, it's not going to be something that they can sync up. But for somebody who is, say, tuning into this and they're aware of light and they put in proper precautions, theoretically, can they switch that internal clock?
Yeah, I mean, so some studies from Harvard actually did that. They increased the amount of light in the workspace to 2,000 lux or more, I think it was. And then they hid them from natural light during the day. And just like when you fly across multiple time zones, those individuals adapted. And there's a real world example of this. In the North Sea, the people who work on the oil rigs, They're out on the platforms at night, these vast, great, sort of light banks, and then they're sleeping during the day in windowless metal boxes, and they adapt. Trouble is, they don't like it, because 2 weeks on, 2 weeks they go back for shore leave, and they're 12 hours shifted from their friends and family. And so when asked, where would you rather feel impaired, when you're socializing for your 2 weeks of shore leave, or while you're working on the rigs, they would prefer to be sort of better adapted during the shore leave and feel grotty on the rigs. So it's very interesting. In theory, we could shift them, but a lot of people don't want to be shifted. And of course, practically, it's very difficult for many workers from hiding from light during the day, because that's when a lot of other activities are sort of going on. I mean, for many individuals, particularly women, it's the only time you can combine a family with your career. Many nurses, for example, choose to do the night shift because they can get the kids off to bed. They go on the night shift, they're back before the kids are going off to school. It's a brutal regime.
So other than the light piece, for somebody that is in that boat, are there certain quote unquote hacks or things people can do to make that transition to working nights more smoother on the body and the internal clock?
Well, I think you raise a really important issue here, and it relates to the duty of care of an employer to their employees. So, for example, you finish the night shift and you drive home. Well, a study from the UK showed that 57% of junior doctors had either had a crash or a near miss on the drive home. So you should be advising those individuals, or indeed supplying them with devices that go on the dashboard which tell you if the car is moving laterally or if it's detecting head nod, and that will set off an alarm to show that you're falling asleep. And of course, high-end German cars at the moment have that technology built into them, and I think we're going to see that increasingly. You see poor physical health. We talked about poor cognitive health in night shift workers, but what you also have is altered stress responses, you have cardiovascular disease, you have obesity, you have metabolic abnormalities. And so what are we giving our night shift workers to eat? Well, it's fast food, high in fat, high in sugar, vending machines full of chocolate bars. What we should be providing our night shift workers is protein-rich, easy-to-digest food. And to my knowledge, nobody's actually doing that to mitigate some of these problems that you get in terms of metabolic abnormalities in our night shift workers. Poor physical health generally. Why aren't we having higher frequency health checks? Who are those in those individuals who are vulnerable? So we can catch diabetes 2, for example, or obesity before these conditions become chronic and become much more difficult to treat. Another area would be in some night shift workers have a divorce rate that's 6 times higher than the equivalent day shift. So we need to provide education to alert not only the worker of what's going to happen to them, but to their extended family or the group of people that they're living with. So, you've married this partner who's this fantastic, empathetic, great sense of humor, lots of fun, and they've turned into this sort of morose, irritable monster. And it's not their fault. It's an inevitable consequence of working outside, forcing their biology to do something which it shouldn't do. And that's be active when their biology is telling them to be asleep. So there are things that we can do. Other areas, there's lots of confusion about apps and sleep apps and all the rest of it. There's masses of stuff there. We could improve education in that sector. And I suppose one final area would be, well, there's morning people and there's evening people, and most of us are somewhere in between. You could relatively easily chronotype your workforce. Obviously this would be a voluntary thing, but knowing that you're on the owl spectrum, you would be better doing the night shift. You certainly don't want to be one of the groups coming in on the early, in the morning shift. So try and fit the body clock type to the particular shift schedule you're going on. And to some extent, you see that happening naturally in taxi drivers. And I can never resist sort of saying, well, how do you sleep? Are you constant nights? Are you constant early morning? And they said, yeah, so I find it better just to be, night shift worker and all the time. And it works for their particular body clock. Now, most of us are in the middle, so we're only talking about a relatively small number, but it would make sense just to match their biology onto their demands of work.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the 24/7 society is here to stay. Our economies are dependent upon night shift work. I don't think we always have to do night shift work. I think, just because we can doesn't mean to say we should. But, our frontline staff, our nurses, our doctors, they have to be there. And as do many other, our firefighters, our police. And so there are ways of mitigating some of the problems. The other really important point, and it hasn't been tested, is that some of the really major health problems, cardiovascular disease, metabolic abnormalities, and the risk of cancer, it's worth bearing in mind that the studies on nurses, for example, and their higher rates of colorectal cancer and breast cancer are now so robust, those studies, the World Health Organization has classified night shift work as a probable carcinogen. So, we need very much to be sensitive to those issues.
You've touched on this chronotype piece a couple times. I want to make sure we clarify for people who are just getting little bits and pieces. So basically, chronotype is we have these 3 different types, and I want to come to what is at the root of this. I want to know if it's genetic or what it is. But basically, we have these predispositions to being a night owl, a morning person, or somewhere in between, which you've been touching on. Talk more about that, and then what is the root of that? Is it nature, nurture, a combo of both?
Great question. So what determines our chronotype are 3 things. One is our genetics. And so there are subtle changes in some of those key clock genes, which can speed up or slow down the clock. So, even tiny changes, 1 amino acid change in one of those clock proteins. There's a condition called familial advanced sleep phase syndrome. And those poor individuals are wanting to go to sleep at around about 7 o'clock in the evening, and they're waking up at about 4 o'clock in the morning. Their whole clock has been advanced through time. That's one tiny change in their genetics. So there's genetics. The second thing is age, and this is really interesting. So from about the age of 10, we want to go to bed a bit later and a bit later and a bit later. And that peaks in the late teens, early 20s. Women tend to peak a little bit earlier than men, about 19 and a half, men 21 and a half. And men tend to be later on average than women. They're more owl-like. And then from the late teens, early 20s, there's a slow move as you age. So the time you're in your 60s, you're getting up and going to bed at about the time you got up and went to bed when you were 10. So you've gone full circle. The important thing, though, is that the difference between somebody in their late teens, early 20s and somebody in their mid-50s, early 60s is about 2 hours. So making a teenager get up at 7 o'clock in the morning is like making a 55-year-old get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's that. And of course, what's driving it, and it's almost certainly the changes in the sex steroids, testosterone, estrogen, which we know is interacting with the biological clock. There's very nice studies showing that. So it follows that pattern. So we've got genetics, we've got age due to circulating sex steroids. Third thing, back to light again. It's when we see light. Dusk light delays the clock. Morning light advances the clock. And so when we're all agricultural workers, we got symmetrical exposure to dawn and dusk, so we stayed on track. But in our urban environments, we get selective light exposure. And so for many people, they may miss morning light, the advancing portion of light, and they may get evening, late afternoon light, which will cause them to be delayed. So there's 3 factors. When you see light, how old you are, and your genetics all interact to produce this spectrum of larks and owls and doves in the middle. There's lots of other strange animal terms for this, but I like the old way of larks, owls, and doves.
I'm glad you got into that piece about as we're aging, we're going to have different, sleep tendencies, and for males and females. Let's zoom back and talk from a general sense now about how much sleep we need. So as a general statement, because I'm sure everybody knows, just like drink 8 glasses of water, 8 hours is thrown around as, the standard everybody should be getting for a baseline of sleep. So how much in a general sense? And then let's go to special populations. So for young kids, babies, and then as we get older, so we can come back to the science and get the amount of sleep we need to support our biology.
I think that's so important. The first point to make is there's huge variation between individuals, and indeed, as we've touched on, as we age. And sleep is like shoe size. One size does not fit all. You may have the average, shoe size, but you wouldn't force that on the entire population. And so in adults, so let's say 18 to 50 or so, the average would be around about 8 hours, but it can be as short as 6, and it can be as long as 10 and a half or even 11. And the key thing that each of us needs to do is define what our individual sleep needs are and keep on refreshing this. So how do you know if you're getting enough sleep? And it's not rocket science. Do you feel optimally able to function during the day? Are you firing on all cylinders? That's it's kind of an obvious one. But also, if you're dependent upon an alarm clock or somebody else to wake you up in the morning, you're not waking naturally from sleep. If you oversleep extensively on free days, this is really important. So you're doing that sort of catch-up sleep. Many teenagers, of course, massively oversleep at the weekend. And then, of course, that's bad because they're missing the morning light, which is therefore they're getting the evening light, delays the clock, makes it more difficult to get up on a Monday. And also, when I say free days, weekends, fairly good, but holidays are a great way of unmasking your sleep. You're decompressing and you're finding out exactly what your sleep pressure, your sleep needs are. Does it take a long time to wake up? Do you have this sort of grogginess, the sleep inertia? Do you crave a nap during the day? That's pretty good metric that you're not getting enough sleep at night. Do you show overly impulsive behaviors? Are you doing stupid and unreflective things? Do you crave caffeinated and sugar-rich drinks to try and override this sleep? And very importantly, and people don't like this at all, is listen to your friends, your family, your work colleagues. If they say, Jesse, you're being a bit irritable. You're being a little bit impulsive here. You don't have the same empathy that you did, and you seem a bit disinhibited. Now, we really do need to listen to our friends and family. That will all tell you if you're not getting enough sleep. And then you need to develop some corrective behaviors to try and get the sleep that you need. Key thing is that sleep is immensely dynamic. So when we're babies, we may sleep as many as, I think when newborns can sleep 18 hours a day. And then as we age, the sleep levels drop. And in advanced age, so there tends to be a lower sleep duration, lots of individual variation. Many elderly people say, gosh, I wish I had the sleep that I had when I was 30. Well, you won't. It'll be different. And I think it's embracing the type of sleep that you've now got. A very close family member in our family said she's never had better sleep since she retired, doesn't have to worry about the kids. And we were told very firmly not to ring before 11 o'clock in the morning. You just sort of get the sleep that optimizes your personal performance and your what makes you you. Yeah. So it does change a terrific amount.
What would you say to the person who's tuning in saying, okay, I'm getting good sleep on a regular basis, but I have these blocks here and there for maybe a few days
Yeah.
where I'm sick or a partner's sick, or
Mhm.
we could get into and open that whole bag of worms, like a new parent
Yeah.
and dealing with kids that are up during the night.
Yeah.
Why I want to go here is you talked about teenagers sleeping in on weekends and sleeping differently on holidays. What do you recommend to that person when it's just periodically they're not getting a good sleep to make up for that so they can get back on track?
Yeah. I mean, and you can do catch up sleep, but only so far. So many people don't have very much the sleep that they need during the week. They're driving themselves on coffee, and then they rely on a long extended sleep over the weekend. You don't catch up sufficiently over the weekend if you've had 5 days of restricted sleep. It takes a while. So it's not a good strategy. So basically, you should try and keep your sleep-wake cycle as stable as possible, both on free days and on work days. But you raise a really interesting issue about parents and children. And there's a real tension going on here, because the way we bring up our children has changed enormously within 2 or 3 generations. Many of us lived in extended family groups, and if we weren't in the same house, then there would be friends and family who were adjacent to us. With the nuclear family, and of course, when we lived in an extended family, childcare was distributed across lots of family members, sisters, mothers, aunts. And so it wasn't the sole responsibility of the parents, and usually the mother, for childcare. But in the nuclear family, you've lost that extended social contact. And I think it's immensely distressing because, young mothers feel that they can't cope because they're chronically tired. Well, we've never evolved for a single parent to look after exclusively the child. And so, people need to realize that this is not all of the primates, the apes, they have extended family care across the group. And so reaching out for help and saying, look, can you be on hand? Can you do this? Is not a failure at all. It's actually embracing sort of what we've done traditionally for hundreds and thousands, in fact, millions of years. And so I feel desperately sorry for young parents, and particularly young mums, who don't realize that it's not their failure at all. It's just a radical change in the way we live our lives, and we don't live in an extended family group any longer.
That's such a good point. And for a mom out there who takes your advice and they reach out for help, that could be a piece of this. But what would you say to them to help make up for that lack of sleep that inevitably is going to happen at night? Like we talked about naps quickly there. And
Yeah.
if you're somebody that's relying on those as a quote unquote general person, that's not a good thing. It's probably signifying you're not sleeping well at night. But what can moms do who are reaching for help where they can, but they're still pushing through, tired a lot of the time? Is a nap a good thing? And what other, again, coming back to hacks, what would you recommend?
Yes, certainly. When the baby is asleep or the young child is asleep, you take that opportunity to sleep as well if you're falling down. Don't think, right, now I can do all the chores. Well, the chore that you need most is to catch up with some sleep. And so prioritize sleep. It is not an indulgence or a luxury. It's going to make you a much better person, and indeed potentially a much better parent, because you'll be able to deal with all of the irritations that you'll have to deal with. So very much. And I think it's important that before a child arrives, baby is born, you've actually worked out some sort of infrastructure whereby there are key people you can reach out to and say, look, I'm sorry, have you got an hour? Can you just come over, sit on the sofa with a baby while I just go and get an hour's sleep? And that's the thing, embrace this. Don't be afraid of it. It's what each of us needs to do.
And for somebody who is turning to caffeine in that time, or it is a chronic thing through society as a whole right now, using that, you mentioned it before, using that as a drug to push through when we're tired, talk about the physiology. What is that doing to the body?
Yeah,
and
great.
Why is that not a good thing, just to block that signal?
Yeah. So what's happening with caffeine? We talked about that sleep pressure. Well, part of the sleep pressure that builds up the longer we've been awake is a substance in the brain called adenosine. And in fact, if you give adenosine, it can put animals to sleep. We can monitor adenosine, and it tracks sleep pressure very effectively. It's not the only element of sleep pressure. But what does caffeine do? Well, it blocks adenosine receptors within the brain. So it masks the fact of how tired you are. So, you do really feel more awake because you blocked the effect of adenosine on the brain. The problem is when the caffeine is metabolized, then you can feel overwhelmingly tired and then just fall asleep uncontrollably. The other problem, of course, is if you're relying on caffeine to keep you awake during the day, as many people do, then it takes a while for the caffeine to go away and unblock those adenosine receptors, which means that you get desperate. You think, oh my goodness, I've got to get some sleep. What am I going to do? I'll just have a whiskey or two, just to, and of course, or take a sleeping tablet. And these are sedatives. They're not biological replacements for sleep. Alcohol is particularly effective at interfering with memory consolidation and the processing of information whilst we're asleep. So don't fall into this stimulant sedative loop that many of us have done during our lives, and many people still do, just to get through. Try and break it. It's brutal, it's difficult, but it's not a healthy way of sustaining behavior.
When you talk about alcohol there on the other end of the spectrum, using that to calm down and not being a good thing, which I totally agree with, it brings up for me what might be a good thing. We talked about melatonin in the beginning and how that's overhyped, but are there any other supplements, natural things that science is behind that people could use either on a regular basis or for when they need to make up for a lack of sleep?
The short answer is sadly not. The best cognitive enhancer we have is sleep. And again, it's all about realizing that and defending our sleep and prioritizing it and not feeling guilty about it. So frustrating, sleep is for wimps. And of course it's not. Essentially, it defines so many of our important attributes, and we've got to take it seriously. Yeah. But by the way, when we're talking about, we sort of talked, and we did a study a few years ago. We talked about night shift workers. We've sort of touched on the business community and lack of sleep. But one thing we haven't talked about is individuals from a lower socioeconomic grouping. So we did some studies a few years ago, and we asked early adolescents, did anybody share their sleeping space with them? We were just trying to get a sense of, what their sleep was like, whether there's sort of older, younger siblings in the same room and all the rest of it. What we stupidly did not ask is, do you have a bed? And what we then became aware of is that many kids don't have their own bed, and they are trying to sleep on the family sofa, or the parents are watching television, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on. So those kids are being chronically sleep deprived, which means that when they go to school, they're being marginalized from those educational opportunities, which means that their trajectory is already being badly affected. And I think poor sleep is also a hallmark of poverty. And I don't think we fully appreciated the importance of that in the way we think about how can we help lower socioeconomic groups. And in fact, we've got to find ways to enhance sleep. In fact, there was a study from the States which showed that I think providing a pillow even helped kids get better sleep and improve their potential educational performance. So yeah, it's also a socioeconomic issue.
That's such a good point. And this is going to be in contrast to that, not on purpose, but just happens so. The fact that for somebody who is lucky enough to have a comfortable bed and a pillow and the means to make changes to the way they sleep, what I'm getting at here is their environment specifically. Let's talk about what somebody can do. We already got into the light piece. We're going to dim our light at night when we're in that last half hour before we go to sleep. But let's get into other things we can do to that sleep environment to enhance sleep.
And of course, this has been one of the great problems during lockdown. because bedrooms were turned into offices. And so you could never separate the working environment physically from the sleeping environment. And so the bedroom and the bed need to be havens of sleep. And the trouble is, again, it's an economic issue. Many of us are lucky enough to have, a bedroom, and it's not combined with anything else. So that's the first tricky point. So the bedroom itself shouldn't be too warm. Part of going to sleep is a subtle drop in core body temperature. It's only about a degree, but it's really important to experience. And if the bedroom is too hot, then it's more difficult to lose that core body temperature and then get to sleep. This is a real problem for partners in the same bed. They may have different temperature demands. I remember talking to a couple in Australia, in the mining district in the Pilbara, on the northwest of the extraordinary continent, and they said, it's just terrible. What saved our marriage was a cooling device. I won't name the company. A cooling device on one side of the bed, so one partner was cooler than the other. So temperature is important. Again, problems, it's another issue of poverty. Keep it quiet. If it's not quiet, many student dorms, many students use white noise generator or the sound of the sea or something just to block out some of the noise. Keep it dark, particularly during the summer with very early mornings. You can 4 o'clock light, so try and keep the light out until you actually need to see it. It's not a contradiction from what I was saying as the photon shower first thing in the morning. If it's too early, it can make you get up too early. You've got to get the balance right. Remove, where possible, your TV, your computers, your smartphones, and all the rest of it. If it is also your bedroom, your workroom, your office, then try and just wheel it next door. I know it's complicated, but try and physically isolate the spaces. Smartphones are terribly difficult because, people are checking emails, they're doing social media, they're looking on the news reports, all this sort of stuff. And this acts as an incredible alerting effect on the brain. So be strong. Use, put the smartphone outside. Don't clock watch. This is, again, a really important point. So many of us have those clocks with an illuminated dial. And we'll talk about waking up in the middle of the night in a moment. But if you wake up in the middle of the night and you become conscious that you've woken up, the first thing that many of us will do is look at the illuminated dial. And then you think, oh my God, I've only got 2 hours before the alarm clock goes off. Oh, God, I think you get all stressed and anxious, and you never get back to sleep. So cover the dial. It's when the alarm goes off that's the critical point, not how long before it goes off. And even an extra 15 minutes or half an hour is good for you to have that extra bit of sleep. Don't take sleep apps too seriously. None of them have been endorsed by the sleep federations. None of them are FDA approved. They can be deeply misleading. So they can tell you you've had a wonderful night of sleep or a terrible night of sleep or you've had lots of slow wave. They aren't accurate enough to do that. What they're useful for is telling you roughly when you went to sleep, how many times you woke up, and when you woke up finally in the morning. And that could be useful because you can change your behavior, like losing weight. You change your eating behavior, you weigh yourself in the morning, you see, I've lost a bit of weight, that reinforces the changed eating behavior. And of course, the same can be true for a sleep app. They're not, I'm very down on them because they're overcomplicated, they can be misleading, but the fundamental measurement of a rest activity cycle can be quite useful. I'm down on them because, when I've given public talks, I had one chap come up to me and say, I'm really worried I'm not getting enough slow wave sleep. And I said, well, how do you know? And he said, well, my app is telling me. And I said, okay, well, first of all, we don't really know what slow wave sleep is all about. And I don't think there's any need to particularly worry about it if you're getting the sleep that you need. He said, no, I know I'm not getting enough. So what I do is I set the alarm clock for 3 a.m. to check how much slow wave sleep I've recorded on my app. That raises another really important point because now we've gone from regarding sleep as a luxury in the 80s. And, I've done another all-nighter. Oh, congratulations. Thinking it's this sort of sleep is for wimps. To what? 40 years later, thinking that, my God, if I don't get the right sort of sleep, I'm going to die. I spoke to another person who came up to me and said, I don't get 8 hours of sleep. Am I going to die? And I said, well, yeah, you're going to die, but it may have nothing to do with the fact that you're not getting 8 hours of sleep. So there's a new condition called sleep anxiety. And people get frightened about not falling asleep or waking up. And that actually affects their sleep. So it's just chill, relax about it. I mean, sleep is variable. It will be variable. Don't get worried about it. So we've touched on this. The bed, when you're in bed, keep a routine on free nights, free days and work days. I think the Brits, I don't know about you guys, are a little bit cheap with their bedding. And I don't know, maybe perhaps it's my generation. And, you have to remember that 30% of our lives will be spent in bed, approximately. So it's worth investing in a mattress that is comfortable, lovely pillows, a good duvet, and something that you just enjoy being in, rather than you feel, oh, well, I've just got to use this sort of block of wood to sleep on. So I think it's worth investing in good bedding, good bed, and all the rest of it.
Before you move on, I want to touch on something within that piece.
Yeah.
Is there any science showing us that different firmness of mattresses are better than others?
There's not a great deal of really good research, but there is some research suggesting that those mattresses that take heat away from the body, people get better sleep than a conventional mattress. So there is a little bit, but we need a lot more. And of course, there's going to be lots of individual variation. So it's going to be a very hard study to undertake. But so the mattresses that take heat away, which makes sense because if you build up heat overnight, then that can actually wake you up. If you can wake up too hot.
And what about sleep position? Is there an ideal? Should we be trying to sleep on our stomachs, our backs, sides?
I think you just do what works. And of course, for some people, there may be a health issue, bad back, or some other physical problem. And that can really impede sleep enormously. We'll come on to, we might as well discuss it now, which is obstructive sleep apnea, which is you tend to have more frequently in men and heavier men, but women get it as well, and thin men get it. And it's a collapse of the musculature of the throat and the neck, which then impedes the airway. In fact, interestingly, and I found out about this fairly recently, it's a bit sad, but as we get older, we deposit fat in our tongues. Our tongues become fatter, and that can flip back and produce this blocked airway. And you know it in a partner because they're almost certainly going to be snoring, and then you'll have silence while they've stopped breathing. And then there'll be a great gasp as the brain wakes them up because it realizes it's being deprived of oxygen. And the really dangerous thing about that, of course, is that you get these great surges in blood pressure, which can be bad if you've got coronary heart issues. There's a higher frequency of stroke with obstructive sleep apnea, but also if you have diabetes too, your small blood vessels in the eye are more vulnerable to damage with big surges in blood pressure. So what do we do about a snoring partner that doesn't have sleep apnea? If they've got sleep apnea, then CPAP, which is these masks with air, work for more than 90% of individuals. It might take a bit of getting used to, but do that always in preference to surgery or any other interventions. It genuinely works. John Stradling, who is the professor of respiratory sleep medicine in Oxford, he's retired now, but he's done a lot of work in this area, and he's absolutely convinced that the first attack is CPAP, and find a mask that works. So it can be sorted. What happens if you can't stand your partner snoring? And this is a problem for many, many individuals, particularly, again, more elderly couples. And my advice is straightforward. If you can, sleep in a different room. And many people feel that, oh my goodness, this is the end of my marriage. If we're not sleeping in the same bed. I say, of course it's not. It just means you're both going to get better night's sleep. You're going to be more empathetic the next day. You're going to enjoy each other's company more. You're going to have a greater sense of humor. It should not be stigmatized. So if you can, sleep in a different room.
I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to jump in and ask about that because it has become a societal norm that couples do sleep in the same bed. And, taking a quick look at that situation, it seems like there's, one big positive and maybe, a couple other ones, but there's so many negatives that could occur from being that close throughout the night.
Yeah. In fact, a young lad came up to me after a public talk, and I sort of mentioned this. He said, how old do you have to be before you can sleep in separate beds? Which I thought was hilarious. But, it's stigmatized. It shouldn't be. I mean, the priority should be getting a good night's sleep. It does not reflect at all on the quality of your relationship. In fact, your relationship will be improved because you'll sleep better and then you'll feel better. Yeah.
Such a good
so
point.
What else? What have we got? We've talked about the bed. We've talked about keeping the bedside lights low. We talked about earplugs or not. Oh, one thing that I hear people talk to me about a lot, and the scientific basis for this is not great, but defining the sleeping space, the bedroom, with a particular smell, lavender, whatever. It may be your partner's perfume or aftershave. And so that when you're going into that space, that smell is associated with sleep. And so it helps define the sleeping space. And in fact, people have told me that if they travel a lot and they go to hotels and stuff, they will take a small amount of their partner's perfume or aftershave or lavender, depending on how they define their sleeping space, put it in the hotel, and it helps them get to sleep. Now, it could be what the mechanisms are unclear. It could be simply a placebo effect, but I can see psychologically it will help define the sleeping space. So in theory, it could make sleep more easier. And the final thing I'd like to say, sorry, and I'm going on, is that waking up in the middle of the night. So people get very anxious about this. We're told the perfect sleep is 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Well, it's just nonsense. It may be on the average, but in fact, sleep historically, pre-industrial, was, and Roger Eckert has done some beautiful work on this, looking at historical records, showing that human sleep was either biphasic, go to sleep, wake up, interact at some level, go back to sleep again, wake up, go back to sleep, or polyphasic, with a series of wake-ups and going back to sleep again. People don't know that's the natural state, and that humans are like all other mammals and have that kind of interrupted sleep pattern. So again, what happens is people wake up, they think, oh my God, I'm never going to get back to sleep. I better start doing my emails and drinking coffee. And of course, it's the anxiety. And it raises another point, which is that most people don't have a sleeping problem. They have a stress or an anxiety problem, which prevents them either getting to sleep in the first place or getting back to sleep if they've woken up. So stress management and relaxation techniques are incredibly important in helping individuals get better sleep.
Now, that's a great overview. Thank you for that. And we've talked a lot about light, but you do talk about this one study in the book, and I want to make sure we get into this and debunk it. Light sensors in the skin, because we've made it clear now that the eyes are part of this, and that intuitively makes sense.
Yeah.
But I have, in the health and wellness space, heard a lot of talk, and I've heard of this study come up a number of times where light is shined behind the knee, and that's actually affecting the internal clock.
Yeah.
So let's talk about this. I think it's important because if we're going to be cognizant of the light, we want to know where it can come in and impact things.
There's two areas of huge problems here. One is a paper that came out in Science in 1998, from a study in the States, suggesting that light behind the knee could shift the biological clock. And this created a massive media storm. And people were patenting light devices. People were going to have little light devices in aircraft seats and all the rest of it. And those of us who've been working in this space were deeply skeptical, because we said, well, hang on, how can this work? Because if you don't have eyes, you can't regulate the clock. What's the basis for this? And there was some absurd idea that light behind the knee would liberate nitric oxide from the blood. Nitric oxide would then go to the brain and shift the biological clock. Well, the half-life of nitric oxide in the blood is a few seconds, so it just the whole mechanism is flawed. So many of us were very uneasy about this. And I think it was named, key paper of the year for science. And I remember going to India and speaking to a wonderful young researcher who came up and said, oh, yeah, you work on light. And what I'm going to do my PhD on, it's going to be light behind the knee, regulating the biological clock. And I thought, there's limited resources. Here's an individual's future. And this is the last thing I would put a student of mine on. But it's in science. And therefore, it's the highest, one of the great journals, scientific journals. And then a bunch of people, as is the nature in science, try to replicate the findings. There were a series of studies which didn't do exactly the same approaches and failed completely. And then Chuck Seisler's group at Harvard mimicked the study exactly with using the same light sort of blankets, the same everything, and failed utterly and completely to replicate the study. Interestingly, the original study is well remembered. All of the studies which showed it was nonsense are not, and that paper's never been retracted. So, yet there is absolutely no evidence for it. You can sort of, and in fact, I was quite irritated because we were working on these non-visual photoreceptors. We'd published studies on mice saying, visually blind mice can still regulate their clocks, and they cited our stuff, incorrectly as support for their work. And so anyway, in fact, I'm particularly sensitive to this because I do remember writing a grant to the Medical Research Council in the UK, and the grant was destroyed. And the comments that came back were, why is Foster looking for new photoreceptors in the eye when we know there are light sensors behind the knee? So, I was kind of bruised by this whole thing. So that one is absolutely, convincingly, utterly wrong. The latest reincarnation of this is a device which you pop into your ears and you blast light into the brain and through the ear canal, and that will get rid of seasonal affective disorder, it'll get rid of jet lag and all the rest of it. This too is completely nonsense. They're expensive devices. They've made a hell of a lot of money out of this. And it was based originally on a brain imaging study suggesting that there's a brain photoreceptor, because when you illuminate the ear canal, you can see modulations in the electrical activity of the brain. I showed this to, there's a phenomenally good brain imaging group here in Oxford, and I said, what do you reckon about this? They said, looks a bit dodgy to me. So what we did was then repeat the experiment in individuals with no eyes, individuals with eyes, because of course the thought was, well, maybe light's getting through the back of the eye and changing electrical activity. We found through functional brain imaging studies no evidence at all for this brain. We couldn't replicate their original findings, their brain imaging studies, and therefore the basis for this study. I've read an article, it was reviewed in The Guardian in the UK, and, devices are given sort of stars. This got no stars at all, and it got absolutely trashed. So I think a lot of people have bought it and have been very disappointed. So these things surface from time to time. It is interesting, and it makes a great splash. And then it lingers in the sort of collective memory and sort of really muddies the waters of the real scientific advances.
Do you think there's a chance science will find any other photoreceptors in different areas of the body? Maybe the mouth, the nose,
Yeah.
anything that you could think of?
I certainly wouldn't exclude it. I think, as a scientist, you couldn't possibly. And there are some weird, potentially light-sensitive molecules that are lurking around, but they have never been linked to the functions that we've been talking about, the regulation of the clock, levels of alertness, or other sorts of behavioral changes. So I'd never say no, but show me the data, and show me the data that's been undertaken, in a randomized controlled trial, doing it properly. And that's what we lack. And I'm amazed that so much rubbish gets published after so-called peer review. It's very damaging, actually. And it can hurt a lot.
Well, let's debunk one more myth before we part ways here, and that is that 1 hour of sleep before midnight counts for 2 after midnight. So first of all, where did this come from? Is there any science that led people to start talking about that? And then is there any truth to that at all?
To my knowledge, there's no science that supports that. Where could it have come from? I'm not sure. But my guess would be that we've talked about REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, and non-REM sleep. Non-REM sleep is associated with deep, slow wave sleep. And that's probably where most of our information processing and memory consolidation is going on. REM sleep is our dream sleep, our most vivid and complicated dreams, and that's been associated with the processing of emotional information. So what happens is that we go through cycles of REM, non-REM sleep, about 4 or 5 throughout the night. Now, they're not identical. The first half of the night, there's more slow wave deep sleep. So it could be that there's more memory consolidation and the processing of information during the first half of the sleep episode. That seems likely. And less of that more emotional processing during the second half. And people, when they're selectively deprived of REM sleep, do become more anxious and are more worried about stuff. So it could be something embedded there that, the first half, before midnight, let's say, where you're getting most of your deep sleep, could be better, and more deep sleep is more important than REM sleep. Don't know, but there's it could be explored. I don't think anybody has. The experiments are really tricky because you're going to have to wake people up, and that introduces so many confounders like stress, and again, you're going to disrupt memory versus emotional memory. It's a really difficult set of experiments to do.
So Russell, up till this point, we've went deep into light, all the nuances there in the science, which is so important. And this is a big lever when it comes to setting the circadian clock in our bodies. What I want to get into now is other inputs. So light aside, I know a couple of them are exercise and when we eat food. Earlier, you touched on quality of food when we were talking about night shift workers and getting more protein. But let's talk about timing of food and timing of exercise and how those impact the clock.
So exercise can be useful in reinforcing the light signal. Light is the most important, but certainly combining a run in the morning, for example, morning light exposure with exercise seems to be a stronger cue for the regulation of the clock. It's not absolutely clear, and some of the data suggests that exercise is not a useful cue in humans. We know it is in mice and hamsters, where it's been studied extensively. So I'm pretty sure that there will be a role of exercise, and I think going for the morning run, where you're getting both natural light and exercise at the same time, is probably the most useful. Food is really important. Now, we talked about light setting the master clock, and then the master clock coordinating the rhythmic activity of all the the peripheral clocks. Every cell in the body has the potential to generate a circadian rhythm, and so the master clock is regulating billions of individual cellular clocks in the organ systems of the body. However, you can uncouple them. Classic experiments in rats, which are nocturnal, so you only allowed the rat to have access to food for 2 hours in the middle of the day when it would normally be asleep. Under a light-dark cycle, the SCN, the master clock, ticked away and was not perturbed at all by that food restriction. However, the clocks of the liver, the gut and muscles moved and aligned themselves to the availability of food. So under certain critical circumstances, we know that the peripheral clocks can be independently regulated by food. Now, that makes sense short term, because after all, if you don't eat, you're going to die. So you don't want a completely rigid circadian architecture where environmental conditions impact upon you. You need to have the flexibility to have that response. And that's a classic example. We know that in humans, again, that food can also shift peripheral clocks. So there is evidence. So when should we eat? And this is also interesting. I think there's broad consensus about this now. If you look at the historical records, in 1100, the major meal of the day was breakfast time, with a light lunch and a small supper. By the Tudor period, so 1500s or so, the main meal of the day had shifted to 11, 12 o'clock, so sort of lunchtime. Then industrialization came along, and individuals' workplaces and where they lived became radically and increasingly separated. So many of us now don't have time for breakfast because we're rushing to commute to get to work. We may have a sandwich for lunch, and then we get home finally at an end of an extended day, zap a whole bunch of stuff into the microwave, and have a massive intake of food. Why is that bad? Well, it looks as though our bodies are still adapted to eating much earlier. If you give the same meal first thing in the morning or before bed, then the levels of blood glucose are completely different. The glucose is rapidly metabolized and used during the first, if it's taken in the morning. At night, it hangs around for much longer, and that glucose is going to be turned into stored calories, either glycogen in the liver or fat. So it's really important to appreciate, and we can go back to exercise actually in a moment, because when we're asleep, we're mobilizing calories to stay alive. We're burning up stored calories. During the day, the default is to burn up the calories we take in. So metabolism is completely different when we sleep versus when we're awake. And so the recommendation is to calorie load breakfast, lunch, light supper, and not what most of us do, which is calorie load late into the evening. And that also brings us back to exercise. So when should you exercise for the maximum calorie burn? Well, it depends. If you exercise before breakfast, you're still on the sleep metabolic status. So essentially, you're burning up stored calories. So if you're a morning person, then exercise first thing in the morning before breakfast means you're going to burn up more stored calories. So that might be a good strategy for what you want to achieve. However, the level of exercise, both duration and power, gets better as you go through the day. So if you want to exercise for longer and more vigorously, that occurs later in the day when core body temperature is higher. So If you're a late person, then it may be easier to exercise later in the day, not too close to bedtime, and then you'll be able to exercise for longer, more powerfully, and therefore burn more of the calories you've taken in during the day and prevent them becoming turned into stored calories as in the form of glycogen and fat. So there's also not only an eating issue, but also an exercise issue there relating to our circadian regulation of metabolism.
When you were talking about breakfast there, and as a whole, how we're rushing out the door and, not having a great breakfast a lot of the time, it gets me thinking about intermittent fasting, which is such a popular thing now in the health and wellness space. And there is some newer research of people skipping dinner and having their meals more condensed in the earlier part of the day.
Yes.
But traditionally, most people, at least since I've been into intermittent fasting the last number of years, skipping breakfast. That seems like the more common thing, probably because of the social aspect of skipping dinner. That's a meal that the family often comes together at the end of the day and bonds and has food together. But what I'm getting at here is it's interesting to think of all these people, myself included at this point. I intermittent fast, typically skip breakfast and have my meals later in the day. How that relates to this whole circadian clock.
Well, on the basis of the data, those glucose studies, it would make a lot more sense. And of course, the historical documents. When you say traditionally, well, actually, no. Traditionally, we ate breakfast lunchtime. My grandparents, my grandfather would come home for lunch and have a sizable lunch. The French still have their main, big lunch and a smaller dinner. So actually, the eating later is a more recent phenomenon. And on the basis of the data, the circadian regulation of metabolism, it would seem to me, and I'm very happy to be corrected, better to front load your calories rather than back load your calories.
Are you familiar with any of the newer research that I was referring to where science is showing that it's better to have the calories earlier in the day?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's consistently. I mean, a whole bunch of different labs around the world have shown that first, having your calories earlier rather than later is better, certainly for glucose metabolism, very, very clearly.
Russell, before we part ways here, I think a good way to come full circle is to talk about sleep as a whole. And what I mean by this is statistics on how people are sleeping these days and where you think this is all going with people like you writing and talking about sleep and the importance and how we can get a better sleep.
Well, part of the reason for writing Lifetime was to try and arm people with the science and our current understanding about circadian rhythms and sleep, and for all of us to take on board and use that information that's individual specific. The key point is assessing how much we as individuals need in terms of sleep when we're most efficient. And it was a real kick against the whole you must do this and you must do that. Sleep is an amazingly dynamic part of our biology. It will change. And I think what we need to do is embrace the sleep that we get, maximize the sleep that we need, using really rather simple behavioral approaches. So let's stop being anxious about sleep. We don't need to be. It's a natural part of our biology. Where we need to be anxious, I think, is making sure that we don't have fatigue. As we said earlier, fatigue is a marker of an underlying health issue. Sleepiness is cured by sleep, and that's what we need to embrace. Fatigue is not.
And you mentioned there sleep being such a primal part of our biology. That being so, which I totally agree with, why is it that so many of us push sleep off and stay up late into the night watching shows and scrolling on social media? The psychological aspect, why do we feel we can cut into sleep, but we're so much more careful? I shouldn't say we are, but there's a lot more talk about diet and exercise, and sleep can often get pushed out of the main view of health and wellness.
Well, I think sleep has been marginalized for such a long time. It's worth bearing in mind that in a 5-year medical training, a doctor will have perhaps 1 or 2 lectures on sleep, but it's been estimated that 30% of the issues that a general practitioner will deal with are either directly or indirectly related to sleep. And they're completely unarmed to deal with it. We've marginalized it. We are the most extraordinary, arrogant species. Just because we can invade the night, and we do so very effectively with cheap light, and we feel that because we can, we must. And in the process, we've thrown away an essential part of our biology. It's part of the reason I think we're such a successful species, because we think, oh, this doesn't, this has nothing to do with me. I can ignore 3 billion, 4 billion years of evolutionary baggage, and just essentially respond to the immediate needs of the past 150 years. And so we're a funny old animal. And I think we basically are fundamentally, what we all crave, I guess, is instant gratification. And that's what you get if you watch a box set or just watch another episode of that one. And we carry on until we, in a sense, collapse. And rather than saying, okay, this has been fun, I now need to indulge in the most important cognitive enhancer on the planet, which is sleep.
Makes a lot of sense to me. And Russell, really enjoyed the conversation. Loved your book. We're going to link up your social media, your book, your website in the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Jesse. It's been a real pleasure meeting you. Take care.
Now that you're done my conversation with Russell, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Roger. He's got a lot more to share when it comes to optimizing your sleep. I'll see you over there.
If you want to stack the deck in your favor, the science says have your calories when your insulin is the most sensitive, and that's in the morning.